Hi, everyone. My name is Shoshana Mostoller, and I work from My Dog is My Home as our storytelling facilitator and technical assistance specialist. I'm also a veterinary social worker. So, for those of you who may not be familiar with veterinary social work, this is a type of social work that addresses the intersection of human needs and animal welfare. So, veterinary social workers support veterinary staff, animal welfare staff, and animal guardians. One of the focus areas of veterinary social work is animal-related grief and bereavement. And this topic is, of course, why we're here today. I'm really excited to see the interest in grief relating to pet loss during homelessness, and I thank you all for joining this session. Just for fun, I've included a picture of my two beautiful dogs on this slide, Cora and Ellen Louise Ripley. They're currently in doggy daycare because I have learned from past conferences that they are not the best conference attendees. The objectives of today's session are to explore pet attachment and the effects of loss of a pet during homelessness, to differentiate between different types of grief, to understand common models of grief, and to learn how to support someone who's experiencing grief due to the loss of a pet. This is a lot to cover in the time that I have, so I'm going to give an overview. And then please feel free to reach out to me after the presentation if you have questions. Much of the information that I'm presenting today pertains to anyone experiencing grief. People who experience homelessness are obviously not alone in feeling grief when a pet is no longer with them. There are, however, some important factors to consider that can make the experience of grief and loss more of a challenge for people who are already in crisis. I want to acknowledge that I'm not a person with lived experience of being homeless with a companion animal. Also, and I cannot stress this enough, people are individuals and have to be treated as such. While I'm giving some basic information about grief and homelessness, everyone will experience the loss of a pet differently. So the discussion during this session can include sensitive topics. Acknowledging loss and trauma of any kind is extremely difficult, and it can trigger a wide range of responses. If you feel upset about anything discussed during the session, I encourage you to seek support in a way that feels safe for you. Please also feel free to reach out to me afterwards if you need help processing any of your feelings during this session. So this is probably not surprising given my role as storytelling facilitator for My Dog is My Home, but I would like to start this session with a story. I originally started working in animal welfare in 2016 at a shelter in Illinois. There was a particular dog named Gucci who had originally been adopted out before I was involved with the shelter. His family ended up having to return him because they needed to move and could not find a place where they could live with him. This family adored Gucci and called every week for several months to see how he was doing. And how was he doing? Not well. He missed his family. He was distressed. He would spin around in his kennel constantly. He was on trazodone and then Prozac, but they really weren't helping his kennel stress. My family ended up fostering him, and he did get adopted, but then he got returned, and he got returned again. We fostered him again. He was an anxious Dalmatian pity mix, and finding him a new home was a challenge. Gucci did eventually get adopted, but he experienced trauma and grief leaving his family that loved him. His family experienced trauma and grief losing the dog that they loved. Gucci was in and out of the shelter several times before he found his permanent home, which compounded that trauma. After all was said and done, a dear friend who I worked with at the time said to me, "It's heartbreaking adopting out animals that already have families." And that really stuck with me. Since that time, I've spoken with hundreds of people who are in crisis and desperately trying to keep their families together. For several years, I ran a crisis boarding program that temporarily houses animals whose families are in crisis. And I really saw firsthand the effect that losing a pet can have on individuals and families. So I'm using this story as an example because in the case of homelessness, grief and loss is often not related to the death of an animal. Giving an animal away, surrendering an animal to a shelter, an animal running away can all cause grief and loss. So before we dive into grief, I want to share some information about the human-animal bond so that we can move forward with a shared understanding of the important relationship between people and their companion animals. The human-animal bond is defined by the American Medical Veterinary Association as a mutually beneficial and dynamic relationship between people and animals that is influenced by behaviors considered essential to the health and well-being of both. I want to stress that this definition uses the word essential to describe the relationship between people and companion animals. The AMVA is saying that this relationship is necessary and indispensable to both people and animals. 97% of pet owners in the United States say that their pet is a part of their family. 51% of pet owners in the United States not only consider their pets to be a part of their family, but say that they're just as much a part of their family as a human family member. These numbers are even higher for people with lower family income. We must understand and acknowledge the importance between the relationship between people and their companion animals if we really want to understand the impact of the death or loss of a pet. So some factors that contribute to attachment to a pet include the amount of time spent with an animal, the role of an animal. Are they a companion animal, an assistance animal, a farm animal, the culture of the pet guardian, and also the amount of social support that person has. So let's circle back to the factors of attachment for a minute. The first factor was how much time a person spends with their animal. In the case of someone experiencing homelessness, an animal may be with their guardian 24 hours a day. Animals that live with people who are experiencing homelessness often go everywhere with their guardian. In terms of the relationship of an animal with an animal, if someone's experiencing a crisis like homelessness, their animal is most definitely providing the same emotional support of an assistance animal, such as an emotional support animal, even if that person does not have a letter that designates the animal as an ESA. There are many cultural considerations as well. Different cultures and religions have different beliefs on the role of animals. If you're unsure of the role of animal in the culture of a person who is grieving the loss of a pet, be sure to ask. Don't make assumptions, and that remember, even within cultures, all people's relationships with their animals are unique. We're going to talk more now about the role of social stressors and social support. Studies have shown that people with other social stressors in their lives experience more intense grief reactions than and that people who are experiencing homelessness also tend to have greater levels of empathy and attachment. We know that homelessness is a deeply traumatic experience. Individuals living without stable housing face constant threats to their physical safety, exposure to violence, and intense social stigmatization. The daily struggle to secure shelter and basic necessities creates overwhelming stress. People experiencing homelessness also have higher rates of mental health challenges, including PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And they often lack proper access to healthcare and emotional support. Most, if not all, people experiencing homelessness have had multiple traumas and losses leading up to their homelessness, which compounds the grief that they feel when they lose an animal. Social isolation is another burden, leaving many without trusted relationships to lean on during times of grief. Studies have shown that the more socially isolated a pet guardian is, the more intense their grief. The loss of a pet, which may be a person's only consistent source of companionship, becomes a devastating blow. Pets offer a kind of unconditional love and loyalty that many people experiencing homelessness may not have in their human relationships. So I mentioned after Gucci's story that grief during homelessness may be caused by animals running away or the relinquishment of a pet to a shelter. While there's not been a lot of research about grief due to pet loss during homelessness, I do highly recommend reading an article that came out last year. It was called A Scoping Review of Forced Separation Between People and Their Companion Animals. In that article, we'll give you more information on how attachment to pets is affected by forced separation due to homelessness, natural disasters, or domestic violence. This article points out that not only do people who are forced to separate from their pets feel significant psychological distress, but they also take risks to ensure the safety of their pet. This is frequently seen in the case of domestic violence when survivors will often stay with an abuser for fear of their safety of their animal. It can also be a factor during natural disasters. So understanding this deep connection between individuals experiencing homelessness and their pets helps to foster compassion and guide effective support. By acknowledging their grief and the importance of that bond, we can play a role in helping people to navigate their loss and begin healing. So what is grief? Grief is essentially the distress that results from loss. In terms of grief relating to pet loss, studies show that many people experience the loss of a pet similarly to human loss. Common reactions to grief can include a sense of numbness, a roller coaster of emotions, reduced concentration, disrupted sleep patterns, changes in eating habits. People may feel sadness, shock, denial, anger, guilt. It's important to remember when you're working with someone who's grieving that people may not understand everything that they're feeling, and they may not share everything that they're feeling with you. So there are many types of grief, but for the purpose of today's presentation, we're going to focus on anticipatory grief, ambiguous grief, and disenfranchised grief. We're also going to distinguish between acute grief and complicated grief. Anticipatory grief occurs before a death or loss. So people may feel guilt or anxiety when thinking about an upcoming separation. They may also prepare by emotionally detaching. Anticipatory grief relating to pet loss is profound, but often overlooked issue within the homeless population. Just the thought of losing a critical companion can trigger intense feelings of grief and anxiety long before a loss actually occurs. Anticipatory grief can be compounded by unique challenges, such as limited access to veterinary care, housing restrictions that prevent pets from being accepted, and the social stigma that often dismisses the importance of the bond with their animals. Without adequate support, individuals facing this type of grief may experience deepened isolation, heightened mental health struggles, and an intensified sense of loss. They may also feel frozen without an idea of how to best move forward. In Gucci's story that I shared earlier, his family likely started experiencing grief well before they had to surrender him to the shelter. Knowing that they would have to surrender him would have brought guilt and fear for his safety. When working within an animal shelter environment or a veterinarian's office, staff may wonder why a person waited so long to make a plan for their pet or be surprised by a lack of emotional response to the loss of their pet. Grief can affect our thought processes, and decision making can be more difficult. In addition, people's emotional responses can be affected by numbness caused by grief or even medications that someone's on. As I mentioned before, people may not express everything they're feeling or even fully understand what they're feeling themselves. Ambiguous grief is a complex form of grief that occurs when there's uncertainty or lack of closure surrounding a loss. In the context of pet loss within the homeless population, this type of grief is particularly significant. Unlike traditional grief, where a loss is clear and acknowledged, ambiguous grief leaves individuals in a painful limbo, wondering about their pet's well-being and even often blaming themselves for the separation. So there are two types of ambiguous loss. Type 1 is when there's a physical absence, but a psychological presence. And type 2 is when there's a physical presence and a psychological absence. So type 1 would be seen in cases of like a pet running away or owner surrender or relinquishment. This would also be a type of grief that is experienced during a natural disaster or with domestic violence, immigration, deportation, if someone has to leave their home without their pet. You would typically see the second type of ambiguous grief in cases of dementia or illness. Your animal may be physically present with you, but their personality or physical behavior has changed, which can cause feelings of grief and loss. This type of grief is particularly relevant when homelessness leads to relinquishment of a pet because people don't know the pet's outcome and will be worried for their pet's safety. This worry is not really unfounded. A study that looked at housing-related relinquishment data from 21 animal shelters show that animals that are relinquished by unhoused people are at greater risk for euthanasia. So this unresolved grief can intensify feelings of guilt and helplessness and compound challenges that are already faced by this population. So disenfranchised grief occurs when a person's loss is not really socially recognized, validated, or supported. For individuals experiencing homelessness, the loss of a pet often falls in this category. We know that animals provide emotional support, companionship, and a sense of stability in the chaotic and often isolating environment of homelessness. However, when a pet dies, goes missing, or must be surrendered due to circumstances beyond their control, the grief that follows is frequently dismissed or minimized by society. Many people fail to understand the depth of the loss and view it as insignificant compared to other challenges that a homeless individual might be facing. So this lack of recognition can intensify feelings of loneliness and exclusion, making it even harder for individuals to cope with their grief. Without social acknowledgement or access to formal grief support services, they may suppress their emotions, leading to profound emotional distress. Once again, when we think of Gucci's story, what do you think might have been the reactions to people who found out that they had to surrender their animal to a shelter? Is this something that they would feel comfortable sharing? A quick look at social media posts regarding surrender of animals and really homelessness with animals in general can show that there's a lot of judgment and hurtful messaging. Many people will not feel comfortable sharing their experience for fear of lack of understanding from the people around them. The immediate response to grief is called acute grief. This intense grief follows a significant loss and is characterized by overwhelming emotions. So the loss of a pet can trigger an acute crisis, amplifying feelings of isolation, despair, and vulnerability, particularly when access to traditional support systems is limited. Complicated grief, on the other hand, occurs when the grieving process is prolonged and interferes with daily functioning. For unhoused individuals with pets, complicated grief may stem from unresolved trauma, repeated losses, and the absence of social and professional support that we discussed earlier. The intense bond formed between a person experiencing homelessness and their pet can make the loss feel insurmountable, leading to persistent depression, guilt, or an inability to move forward. Without adequate resources or mental health care, this type of grief can deepen existing struggles. And I would like to stress that while I am going to go over ways to support people experiencing grief shortly, a person who's experiencing complex grief really does need professional help to manage that loss. So some people will struggle with decision making at the end of a pet's life. It can be hard to know when is the time to discuss euthanasia, and these decisions can come with a lot of guilt for a pet guardian. This is a topic that will also vary by culture. In many Western cultures, euthanasia is often seen as a compassionate choice to prevent suffering when a pet has a terminal illness or severe pain. Hindu beliefs often discourage euthanasia, as karma and natural cycle of life are significant concepts. Within Buddhist and Islamic faith, there can be mixed views, with some believing euthanasia is permissible if an animal is suffering, while others emphasizing a natural death. Many indigenous cultures honor animals deeply, and decisions around euthanasia may involve spiritual guidance or rituals to help the pet transition peacefully. It is important to be aware of cultural beliefs on euthanasia, but it's also important to ask people their feelings and not make assumptions. Decisions on euthanasia can be tricky and can cause a lot of moral distress for the people involved. So, moral distress is when someone believes an action is ethically correct, but feels powerless to take that action. I've seen this occur with veterinarians or other caregivers when they see an animal suffering, but a pet guardian is struggling to make a decision to euthanize that animal. Euthanasia decisions and how we make them is a whole training in and of itself, but it is important to recognize that these decisions are very difficult. And when a person's experiencing homelessness, there are also considerations such as the cost and ability to get to a vet that can provide the service. So many animal shelters provide low-cost euthanasia services, but often people might not be able to be with their pet, and that can cause additional distress. So there are many models that can be used to understand grief. The dual process model of grief suggests that individuals navigate grief by wavering between two types of experiences. One will be a loss-oriented experience, and the other would be a restoration-oriented coping experience. So loss-oriented coping involves directly confronting the pain of losing your pet, experiencing feelings such as sadness and longing and guilt. Whereas restoration-oriented coping focuses on adapting to life without the pet, managing your daily responsibilities, and finding new sources of emotional support or purpose. Rather than following a linear path, grieving individuals often move back and forth between these two states. An important part of this model also is to normalize the grieving process. Shifting between feelings of grief and recovery is a natural part of grief. This model is relevant when discussing pet loss within the homeless population. A person may grieve deeply over the loss of their companion while simultaneously facing practical challenges of daily survival, such as securing shelter, food, and safety. The demands of restoration-oriented coping can be immediate and urgent for those without stable housing, making it difficult to fully process the emotional aspects of their loss. Recognizing and supporting both dimensions of grief can help provide a more compassionate and effective approach to helping people who are navigating their healing journey. The continuing bonds model of grief emphasizes that grieving does not require severing ties with a lost loved one, but rather finding ways to maintain a meaningful and ongoing connection with them. In the context of pet loss, this model recognizes that the bond between a person and their pet can remain significant even after the pet is no longer physically present. For individuals experiencing homelessness, this approach can be especially powerful. After a pet's death or separation, continuing bonds might be maintained through memories, storytelling, or symbolic gestures such as keeping a collar or sharing anecdotes about the pet's impact on your life. This model can provide comfort and reduce feelings of isolation as it validates the enduring nature of the relationship with the pet. For outreach workers or counselors supporting the homeless population, acknowledging and encouraging these continuing bonds can foster healing and emotional resilience. By understanding that love and connection persist beyond the physical loss, individuals can carry their pet's companionship as a source of strength. The Grief Recovery Handbook for Pet Loss outlines how to use the grief recovery method to work through grief relating to loss of a pet. This method is action-based system for moving through the grief caused by the loss of a pet. There are 3 goals when using the grief recovery method. One is to have fond memories of your pet, not turn painful. To remember your pet the way you knew him, and also to have a life of meaning and value, even though your life will be different. The grief recovery method has 7 actions to help you work through the loss of your pet. The actions are to identify the myths that you're telling yourself about pet loss, to identify the short-term energy relieving behaviors. So those are like the distractions that we use to ignore our pain. To make a pet loss graph and a pet relationship graph, to write a letter to your pet, and to read that letter to a human witness. Examples of myths that we might tell ourselves about grief are that we should not feel bad about the loss because the pet is at peace now, that you can just get another pet to replace the pet you lost, that time heals all wounds, or maybe even just if you keep busy, you'll feel better. Examples of short-term energy relieving behaviors are using food, alcohol, shopping, or social media to distract ourselves from the grief. A pet loss graph is particularly helpful for people who have experienced multiple losses. As I mentioned before, the effect of trauma and grief is cumulative. So multiple losses in the past can affect how we're experiencing a current loss. And another important point when using the grief recovery method is that we not only forgive ourselves for things that we regret from our time with our pet, but that we also forgive our pet for things that they may have done that were difficult for us. So you do not have to be a mental health professional to use a trauma-informed approach when working with someone who's experiencing grief. Trauma-informed care is a framework for collaboration with survivors of trauma that acknowledges the prevalence of trauma and also understands the impact of trauma on physical and emotional health. It's important to recognize the signs of trauma, but even if you do not recognize trauma, assume that it's there. Some principles of trauma-informed care include providing physical and emotional safety, choice, collaboration, transparency and trustworthiness, peer support, and using a strength-based approach. It's also important to be aware of the cultural and gender-related issues, biases, stereotypes, and historical trauma need to be recognized and addressed. I mentioned before that homelessness itself is deeply traumatic. There's higher rates of mental health issues among people experiencing homelessness. So this means that using a trauma-informed approach is critical and ensures that we're not re-traumatizing people as they seek services. In the case of someone experiencing homelessness, challenging our biases is especially important. Not everyone is supportive of people experiencing homelessness with pets. We all have biases, but if you're working with a person who's unhoused and grieving, please take a few minutes to acknowledge any biases that you have. Ask yourself, would I feel the same way if this person was housed? Also, I want to emphasize using a strength-based approach. People can be very strong and resilient, even if they're struggling right now. So considering what has worked for that person in the past can help them to move forward in signs of grief and loss. This slide shows some signs and symptoms of trauma that people may experience. You may notice that this graphic shows both physical and emotional symptoms. The symptoms that are shown in orange are psychological symptoms that someone may experience, and the symptoms in green are some of the physical symptoms. You may also notice that the signs of grief that I mentioned earlier are also present here. This, of course, is because grief is trauma. So most of these signs and symptoms are not something that you would necessarily notice by looking at someone. And that's why it's truly important to listen to what people are telling you and to pay close attention to nonverbal cues. So there are 5 tips that can be really helpful when talking to people who are grieving. First, listen more than you speak. Be genuine in your responses. And I mean, if you remember nothing else from this entire presentation, remember, be genuine and be curious. So the next one's be curious about what a person is saying. Be mindful of nonverbal cues and acknowledge what you're told, even if it's different from your own experience. So this is not the time to be sharing your own grief experience. Grief is an intensely personal experience, and sharing your own loss just shifts the focus from that person who's grieving, and it can make someone feel like you're minimizing their pain. Unless someone specifically asks you about how you handled your grief, it's really best to save your stories for another time. While this may not be the time to share your personal grief journey, it is a good time to consider how the grief that you've experienced in your life may be affecting how you're interacting with an individual who's grieving. For example, if I had a dog that died after a long illness, hearing about someone else's grief during a similar type of loss could cause increased empathy and understanding, but it could also cause me to project my own emotions and potentially to avoid the topic of the person's grief. So, what are some things that you can say when someone's grieving? So I would say, tell me about your pet is a really good way to start. It's helpful to use these door openers and empathic statements. So tell me about your pet. What does this loss mean to you? What are your biggest challenges right now? What can I do to make this easier for you? What has helped you in the past when you've experienced loss? It's also the empathic statements, again, are normalizing the grief that someone is feeling. So it's natural to feel this way. This must be so difficult. I can see how much you loved your pet. It's always okay to tell people that you don't know what to say, but that you care about what they're going through. Memorializing our pets, whether through a small ceremony, a keepsake, or simply sharing their story, helps to honor the deep bond that was shared. It acknowledges their grief and allows people to process their loss in a meaningful way. An important thing to remember is to not assume what someone will want as a keepsake. Always ask before presenting something to a person who is grieving. A lock of hair or a nose print may seem sweet to you, but could be distressing for someone else. Journaling can also be helpful for people who like to write. Again, do not make an assumption that this is something that would be helpful. Just ask a person if they would like to journal, or even if they would like to record themselves speaking about their pet. Some people aren't as comfortable with writing their thoughts down. Some good journaling prompts include, my favorite memory of my pet is, I especially miss, it is helpful when I am sad, I will, my biggest struggle today is, I wish I could tell my pet, write about the day you met your pet, I wish that I could forgive myself for, I forgive my pet for, and where in my body do I feel the sadness? So, how can we help unhoused people who are experiencing grief due to the loss of a pet? Honestly, you address it the same way you would address grief with anyone else who's lost a pet. But it is important to remember that that pet may have been their only unconditional support and that there are compounded losses and stressors that may be affecting how an unhoused person processes their loss. To address this issue, it's crucial to foster greater empathy and awareness of the importance of pet companionship within the homeless population. Providing access to grief counseling, peer support groups, and compassionate animal welfare services can help to validate and support their loss. I know it's going to be hard to remember all the information that's given in this training, in any training. So I'd say the most important things to remember are just that people experiencing homelessness most likely have previous trauma and grief that affects and can compound the experience of grief that they're feeling. Companion animals may be providing that person with their only social support and unconditional love. Be genuine and be curious when working with someone who's struggling with the loss of a pet. And most of all, don't make assumptions. Be aware of any biases that you may have and how any past trauma you've experienced may be affecting your response to a person who's grieving. So that's the end of my presentation. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and thanks for joining.